They said justice was blind, but in Copper Ridge it had 20/20 vision when it came to protecting its own. The gavel froze mid-air above Judge Samuel Blackwater's weathered hand, his eyes locked on the trembling figure in iron shackles. Rose Whitehorse wasn't supposed to look him in the eye. The courtroom erupted in whispers that cut through the stifling Texas heat like broken glass. A woman in the back pew gasped, her fan clattering to the wooden floor. The prosecutor's papers scattered as his hands shook, recognizing something in that defiant stare that made his blood run cold. Rose's calloused fingers traced the faded scar on her wrist, the same mark she'd carried since the night her mother died 18 years ago. The girl who once scrubbed floors in silence now stood accused of murder, but her spine remained straight as a rifle barrel. "Hang her at dawn!" someone shouted from the gallery. But outside, through the dusty courthouse windows, a shadow shifted in the saloon doorway. Who was watching? And why did Rose Whitehorse smile for the first time in months? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Copper Ridge had been dying a slow death long before Rose Whitehorse ever set foot in that courthouse. The summer of 1887 brought more than drought to the Texas plains. It brought the kind of desperation that made honest men do dishonest things and turned neighbors into strangers overnight. The town sprawled along the banks of what used to be Willow Creek, back when there was actually water running through it. Now the creek bed lay cracked and empty, lined with the bleached bones of cattle that had died searching for relief. Main Street stretched between two rows of weathered buildings, the First National Bank with its peeling paint and barred windows, Murphy's General Store where credit had run dry months ago, and the Silver Dollar Saloon where men drank away their troubles with whiskey they couldn't afford. At the center of it all stood the courthouse, a monument to justice that had become something else entirely under Judge Samuel Blackwater's 20-year reign. The man who now held Rose's fate in his hands was as much a fixture of Copper Ridge as the church bell that rang every Sunday, calling folks to pray for rain that never came. Rose Whitehorse had arrived in this town 10 years ago as an 8-year-old orphan with Cherokee blood running through her veins and nothing but the clothes on her back. Her mother, a seamstress named Anna Whitehorse, had died of what the town doctor called consumption, though Rose remembered the bruises that no amount of coughing could explain. Judge Blackwater, in what the townspeople praised as Christian charity, had taken the girl into his household as a servant. For a decade, Rose had moved through the judge's grand house like a ghost, scrubbing floors that gleamed like mirrors, preparing meals that filled the dining room with warmth she was never invited to share. She learned to make herself invisible, to speak only when spoken to disappear into the shadows when the judge's voice grew sharp with anger or thick with whiskey. But invisibility had its advantages. Invisible girls heard things they weren't supposed to hear. They saw documents left carelessly on desks, witnessed late-night meetings between men who spoke in hushed tones about land deeds and death certificates. They learned that sometimes the most dangerous place to hide a secret was right in plain sight. 3 nights ago, Rose had been cleaning the judge's study when she discovered the hidden compartment behind his law books. Inside lay a collection of papers that made her blood run cold. Falsified death certificates for Cherokee families, forged land transfers, and a ledger showing payments to Sheriff Tom Ironwood for services that had nothing to do with keeping the peace. The confrontation that followed had ended with Judge Blackwater clutching his chest and collapsing to the floor, his face twisted in pain as foam bubbled from his lips. Rose had run for help, but by the time Dr. Mitchell arrived, it was too late. The only witness to whatever had transpired in that study was a half-Cherokee girl with revenge in her heart and poison within arm's reach. The discovery that would seal Rose's fate had happened 3 nights before Judge Blackwater's death, when the summer heat made sleep impossible and the house creaked like old bones settling into the earth. Rose had been dusting the judge's study, running her cloth over the leather-bound volumes of law books that lined the walls like silent sentinels, when her fingers caught on something that shouldn't have been there. Behind Blackwell's commentaries on property law, hidden in a space carved deliberately into the wall, lay a metal box no larger than a cigar case. Rose's hands trembled as she lifted it free, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. The lock had long since rusted away, and the lid opened with a whisper that sounded deafening in the midnight quiet. Inside were papers that made her world tilt sideways. Death certificates bearing the official seal of Copper Ridge, each one documenting the passing of Cherokee families who had owned land along the fertile banks of what was once Willow Creek. But Rose recognized some of those names, families who had simply disappeared one day, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions. The certificates were dated weeks before these families had vanished, as if death itself had been scheduled like a business appointment. Beneath the certificates lay land deeds, freshly transferred to Judge Blackwater's name for prices that wouldn't buy a decent horse. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oiled cloth like something precious, was a ledger bound in black leather. The pages chronicled payments to Sheriff Tom Ironwood, always in the same amount, always with the same notation: special services rendered. Rose had seen enough violence in her 18 years to recognize the shape of it, even when it was dressed up in legal language and official stamps. This wasn't just corruption. It was murder, carried out systematically and hidden behind the respectable facade of law and order. Her people, her mother's people, had been killed for dirt that most white folks wouldn't have wanted anyway. The confrontation came the next morning. Rose had barely slept, the weight of what she'd discovered pressing down on her chest like a millstone. She found Judge Blackwater in his study, reviewing case files and sipping his morning coffee from the china cup she had washed 100 times before. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air and catching the silver threads in his carefully groomed beard. "I know what you did," Rose said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. The judge didn't look up from his papers. "Close the door when you leave, Rose. I have work to do. I know about the Cherokee families, about the land, about Sheriff Ironwood." This time he did look up. His pale blue eyes, which had always reminded Rose of winter ice, fixed on her face with the intensity of a man trying to read scripture in a foreign language. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I found the box." Rose stepped forward, placing the black ledger on his desk with deliberate care. "I found everything." The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Judge Blackwater's face, which had worn the benevolent mask of respectability for as long as Rose could remember, cracked open to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. His hand moved toward the desk drawer where she knew he kept his Colt revolver, but she was faster. "You killed my mother too, didn't you?" The question emerged from somewhere deep inside her, a place where grief had been fermenting for 10 years. "Anna Whitehorse didn't die of consumption. She died because she found out what you were doing. Your mother was a drunk Indian squaw who got too curious for her own good," Judge Blackwater snarled, his cultured voice dropping away to reveal the crude hatred beneath. "Just like you're getting too curious now." Rose felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, like a piece of ice that would never melt. "The town trusted you. They believed in you." "The town needed me," he replied, rising from his chair with the slow deliberation of a man who had made peace with his own monstrosity. "Do you think any of those shopkeepers and farmers would have cared if they'd known? As long as their children were safe and their businesses prospered, they would have looked the other way." That was when he reached for the drawer. That was when Rose grabbed the crystal decanter from the side table, the one filled with brandy that cost more than most families saw in a month. That was when Judge Blackwater clutched his chest and crumpled to the floor, his face turning purple as white foam spilled from his lips. By the time Rose knelt beside him, checking for signs of life she already knew were gone, Sheriff Ironwood was pounding on the front door with his fists, shouting demands to be let inside. The stranger rode into Copper Ridge like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, his arrival announced only by the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats on packed earth and the soft jingle of spurs that caught the afternoon light. Dakota Stormwind had been many things in his 28 years, a Texas Ranger, a bounty hunter, a man who walked the thin line between law and justice. But he had never been a savior, until today. He dismounted outside the Silver Dollar Saloon with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground, his weathered leather coat dusty from 3 days of hard riding. The black stallion beneath him, a magnificent quarter horse named Thunder, snorted and pawed the ground as if sensing the tension that hung over the town like smoke from a grass fire. Inside the saloon, Mary Clearwater looked up from polishing glasses behind the bar, her weathered hands freezing mid-motion as she recognized the silhouette framed in the doorway. 60 years of hard living had carved deep lines around her eyes, but those eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had kept her alive through 2 wars, 3 husbands, and more heartbreak than any woman should have to bear. "Dakota," she whispered, the glass slipping from her fingers to shatter on the floor behind the bar. "Sweet Mary and Joseph, you came back." He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of winter wheat, and eyes that had seen too much to ever look truly young again. "Hello, Ma," he said quietly, using the name he had called her since the day she found him half dead on the prairie, a 12-year-old boy with no memory of where he'd come from or who he belonged to. Mary Clearwater had built her life on reading people the way other folks read newspapers, and what she saw in Dakota's face now made her heart clench like a fist around broken glass. "You heard about the trial," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I heard a lot of things." Dakota approached the bar, his movements careful and deliberate. "Heard Judge Blackwater died under suspicious circumstances. Heard they arrested a Cherokee girl for murder. Heard she's set to hang at dawn." "Rose Whitehorse," Mary said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Poor child's been living in that man's house for 10 years, treated like furniture, and now they want to string her up for defending herself." Dakota's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Tell me about her." Mary glanced toward the courthouse, visible through the saloon's grimy windows. "Orphaned young. Mother died when she was 8. Anna Whitehorse, sweet girl who sewed dresses for the church ladies. Always suspected there was more to that story than what the doctor put on the death certificate." She paused, studying Dakota's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Funny thing is, Rose reminds me of someone. Can't quite put my finger on who. What makes you so sure she's innocent?" "Because I knew Samuel Blackwater before he became a judge," Mary replied, her voice hardening like iron left in winter cold. "Knew him when he was just another ambitious young lawyer with wandering hands and a mean streak wider than the Rio Grande. That man had secrets buried so deep they'd need a mining crew to dig them up." Dakota absorbed this information with the stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Through the window he could see the courthouse where Rose Whitehorse sat in her cell, probably wondering if anyone in the world cared whether she lived or died. The thought stirred something in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but recognized nonetheless. "There's something else," Mary continued, moving closer to the bar. "Something I should have told you years ago, but I hoped you'd never need to know." "What kind of something?" Mary's hands trembled as she reached beneath the bar and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. "The night I found you, you weren't alone. There was a little girl with you. Couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Cherokee features. Prettiest little thing you ever saw." Dakota's world tilted sideways. "What happened to her?" "I tried to keep you both. Lord knows I did. But a woman running a saloon wasn't considered fit to raise children, especially not Indian children. The judge, Blackwater, he said he'd find her a good Christian home where she could learn proper ways." Mary's voice cracked like old leather. "I never saw her again after that day. But Dakota, I think that little girl grew up to be Rose Whitehorse." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Dakota stared at the wooden box in Mary's hands as if it contained explosives rather than memories. "You're telling me the girl in that jail cell might be your sister?" Mary opened the box with trembling fingers, revealing a small silver locket and a child's drawing rendered in charcoal on birch bark. The drawing showed two children holding hands beneath a tree, the older one clearly protecting the younger. "She drew this the night before they took her away. Said it was you and her, safe forever." Dakota took the locket with hands that shook despite his efforts to control them. Inside was a miniature daguerreotype of a Cherokee woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Our mother?" "Anna Whitehorse," Mary confirmed. "I didn't know her real name until Rose came to town. Didn't put the pieces together until just now, seeing you standing there looking at that picture like you've seen a ghost." Outside, the courthouse bell began to toll the evening hour, each chime a reminder that dawn and Rose's execution was drawing closer. Dakota closed the locket and slipped it into his vest pocket, right over his heart. "I need to see her," he said. "They won't let you into the jail, not unless you're family." Dakota's smile held no warmth, only the cold determination of a man who had just discovered he had something worth fighting for. "Then I guess it's time Rose Whitehorse got herself a husband." The investigation that followed Dakota's arrival in Copper Ridge unfolded like the pages of a book written in blood and deception, each revelation more damning than the last. While Rose remained in her cell, counting the hours until what everyone believed would be her execution, Dakota methodically pieced together a puzzle that had been 20 years in the making. His first stop after leaving the Silver Dollar Saloon was the abandoned Cherokee settlement on the eastern edge of town, where weeds now grew through the floorboards of houses that had once echoed with children's laughter and the songs of mothers preparing evening meals. The federal government had designated this land as part of the Cherokee Reservation in 1867, but by 1875, every family had mysteriously disappeared, their property deeds somehow finding their way into Judge Blackwater's name. Dakota dismounted Thunder and walked through the ghost town with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read violence in the landscape itself. Here, a door hung askew on broken hinges, suggesting a hasty departure or forced entry. There, scorch marks on a cabin wall indicated fire had been used to drive out residents. Most telling of all were the small family graveyards behind each house, where headstones bore dates that predated the family's supposed deaths by months or even years. He pulled out a small leather notebook and began sketching the layout of the settlement, noting details that would matter in a federal courtroom. The Cherokee families hadn't simply left. They had been systematically eliminated, their deaths carefully orchestrated to look like natural causes or accidents. Judge Blackwater's land acquisition scheme wasn't just fraud, it was genocide carried out with the precision of a legal document. As the afternoon heat grew oppressive, Dakota made his way to the county records office, a small building attached to the courthouse where decades of legal documents mouldered in filing cabinets that hadn't been properly organized since the Civil War. The clerk, A nervous young man named Timothy Walsh, who stammered when he spoke, seemed surprised that anyone would want to examine old Cherokee land records. "Most of those families died of disease," Timothy explained, his hands shaking as he pulled out file after file. "Judge Blackwater said it was consumption, mostly. Very sad, but these things happen on the frontier." Dakota studied the death certificates with the trained eye of someone who had investigated dozens of suspicious deaths during his years as a Texas Ranger. The handwriting was identical across documents supposedly signed by 3 different doctors over a span of 15 years. The cause of death was always the same: consumption, fever, or accident. Never violence, never murder, never anything that would attract the attention of territorial authorities. But it was the timing that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Every Cherokee family had died within 30 days of valuable mineral deposits being discovered on their land. Gold, silver, copper, whatever the surveyors found, the Cherokee families who owned the rights to it were dead before the next full moon. "Timothy," Dakota said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect from outlaws and lawmen alike, "I need you to show me every document Judge Blackwater filed in the past 20 years. Land transfers, death certificates, mineral rights, everything." The young clerk's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "I don't know if I'm authorized to—" "I'm a federal marshal investigating crimes against the Cherokee Nation," Dakota interrupted, showing his badge. "You can cooperate with a federal investigation, or you can explain to a territorial judge why you obstructed justice in a murder case." For the next 4 hours, Dakota worked his way through 2 decades of Judge Blackwater's legal machinations. The pattern was always the same. Cherokee families would receive notification that mineral surveys were being conducted on their land. Within weeks, they would be found dead of natural causes. And within months, their property would be transferred to Judge Blackwater for payment of outstanding debts or taxes. The most damning evidence came in the form of bank records that Timothy produced with trembling hands. Regular deposits into Judge Blackwater's account, always in amounts that corresponded exactly to the value of recently acquired Cherokee lands. But the deposits didn't come from legitimate mining operations. They came from a mining consortium based in Austin, a group of investors who had been buying Cherokee land through intermediaries for years. Dakota copied the relevant information into his notebook, his jaw tightening with each new revelation. Judge Blackwater hadn't been working alone. This was a coordinated effort involving bankers, mining investors, and territorial officials who had decided that Cherokee lives were less important than Cherokee mineral rights. As the sun began to set, Dakota made his way to the small house where Dr. Mitchell lived with his wife and elderly mother. The doctor answered the door himself, his face going pale when he recognized the badge on Dakota's vest. "Dr. Mitchell," Dakota said politely, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about some death certificates you signed over the years." The elderly physician's hands shook as he invited Dakota into his modest parlor, where medical techs shared shelf space with family photographs and his late father's Civil War memorabilia. Dr. Mitchell had been practicing medicine in Copper Ridge for 30 years, and his reputation for honesty had made him the town's most trusted healer. But as Dakota spread the death certificates across the coffee table, Dr. Mitchell's composure crumbled like a house built on sand. "I didn't sign all of these," he whispered, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Some of them, yes, but not all. Not the Cherokee families." "Which ones did you sign?" Dakota asked, his voice gentle but implacable. Dr. Mitchell pointed to 3 certificates with shaking fingers. "These 3, old Mrs. Henderson's mother died of heart failure. Young Jimmy Morrison, kicked by a horse. And Sarah Fielding died in childbirth." He looked up at Dakota with eyes full of guilt and fear. The others, the Cherokee families. I never examined those bodies. Then who signed your name to the certificates? Judge Blackwater had access to all the official forms. He said it was more efficient to handle the paperwork himself, especially for the Indian families who lived so far from town. He said they'd already been buried according to their customs by the time anyone could examine them properly. Dakota leaned forward. Dr. Mitchell, I need you to think carefully about what you're telling me. Are you saying that Judge Blackwater forged your signature on legal documents? The old doctor buried his face in his hands. I knew something wasn't right. Consumption doesn't kill entire families at once. Heart attacks don't happen to healthy young men. But Judge Blackwater said the territorial government wanted the deaths documented quickly to prevent disease from spreading to the white community. What about Anna Whitehorse, Rose's mother? Dr. Mitchell's face went ashen. I did examine her body. She showed signs of strangulation, not consumption. But when I tried to file an accurate death certificate, Judge Blackwater said it would cause panic in the town if people thought there was a killer among them. He said it would be better for everyone if the death appeared natural. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dakota had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his hands clench into fists. Anna Whitehorse had been murdered, and her daughter had spent 10 years believing her mother had died of disease. Dr. Mitchell, Dakota said quietly, I'm going to need you to put that statement in writing. And tomorrow, you're going to testify about what you've told me. The old physician nodded miserably. I've been carrying this guilt for 20 years. Maybe it's time for the truth to come out. As Dakota prepared to leave, Dr. Mitchell caught his arm. Mr. Stormwind, there's something else you should know. The night Judge Blackwater died, he came to see me, said he was feeling poorly, asked for laudanum to help him sleep. I gave him a small bottle, enough for a few doses. How much laudanum would it take to kill a man? The whole bottle, taken at once. But Judge Blackwater was experienced with medicines. He would have known the proper dosage. Dakota felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. Judge Blackwater hadn't been murdered by Rose Whitehorse. He had taken his own life rather than face exposure for his crimes, but he had orchestrated his death to ensure that Rose would be blamed for murder. The ride back to town took Dakota through the old Cherokee burial ground, where headstones carved with symbols he couldn't read stood as silent testimony to lives cut short by greed and hatred. In the fading light, he could almost hear the voices of the dead crying out for justice. But it wasn't just the Cherokee families who had suffered. Rose Whitehorse, a survivor of that genocide, had been chosen as the final victim in Judge Blackwater's 20-year campaign of murder and theft. Even in death, the corrupt judge was trying to complete his work by ensuring that the last witness to his crimes would hang for murders she didn't commit. Dakota dismounted at the cemetery and walked among the graves, reading names that had been systematically erased from official records. Whole families, grandparents, parents, children, all supposedly dead of natural causes within days of each other. The scope of the atrocity was breathtaking, and the fact that it had been carried out under the guise of law and order made it even more monstrous. As he stood among the silent headstones, Dakota felt the weight of his Cherokee heritage settling on his shoulders like a ceremonial blanket passed down through generations. These were his people, Rose's people, and they had been slaughtered for the crime of owning land that white men wanted. The least he could do was ensure that their deaths weren't forgotten, that their killer faced justice even if that justice came 20 years too late. The moon was rising as Dakota returned to town, his saddlebags heavy with evidence that would expose one of the most systematic campaigns of murder in territorial history. Tomorrow, he would stand before Judge Morrison and present proof that Rose Whitehorse was not a killer but a survivor, the last living witness to genocide. But first, he needed to prepare for the possibility that some people in Copper Ridge might prefer to see Rose hang rather than have their comfortable assumptions about law and order shattered by the truth. Men who had profited from Judge Blackwater's crimes would not give up their stolen wealth without a fight, and desperate men were dangerous men. As he stabled Thunder behind the Silver Dollar Saloon, Dakota checked his Colt Peacemaker and made sure he had a full box of ammunition in his saddlebags. Tomorrow's trial would be about more than Rose's innocence. It would be about whether a small Texas town was willing to confront the monsters it had created and tolerated for 20 years. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Rose was convicted and hanged, the truth about the Cherokee murders would die with her. But if the truth came out, it would shatter the foundations of everything Copper Ridge thought it knew about justice, civilization, and the price of progress in the American West. One way or another, tomorrow would bring a reckoning that was 20 years overdue. The courthouse had never seen a morning quite like this one. Dawn crept across the Texas sky like spilled blood, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to mock the solemnity of what was about to unfold. By the time the church bell struck 6, Main Street was already crowded with townspeople who had risen before sunrise to witness what they believed would be justice served. Rose sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap with the same composure she had maintained throughout her captivity. She wore the same simple gray dress she had been arrested in, now wrinkled and stained with the evidence of 3 sleepless nights. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, no longer restrained by the tight bun Judge Blackwater had insisted upon. If she was going to die today, she would die as herself, not as the shadow he had tried to make her become. Sheriff Tom Ironwood approached her cell with heavy steps, his keys jangling like wind chimes in a storm. The big man's face was gray with exhaustion and something that might have been regret, though Rose had learned long ago not to trust the expressions of white men in positions of power. "Time to go, miss," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Judge Morrison is waiting." Judge Harold Morrison had ridden in from Austin specifically for this trial, summoned by telegraph when news of Judge Blackwater's death had reached the state capitol. He was a thin, severe man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for efficiency that bordered on ruthlessness. The territorial government wanted this matter resolved quickly and quietly before word of the scandal could spread beyond Copper Ridge. Rose stood without protest, allowing the sheriff to shackle her wrists with iron chains that had held countless prisoners before her. As they walked toward the courthouse, she noticed how the crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Some faces showed curiosity, others disgust or fear. A few revealed something that might have been pity, though Rose had long since stopped hoping for mercy from strangers. The courthouse itself had been transformed for the occasion. Someone had draped black bunting across the windows, and additional seating had been brought in to accommodate the overflow crowd. Every bench was packed, and men stood 3 deep along the walls. Rose recognized most of the faces: the baker who had never met her eyes when she bought flour for the judge's household, the banker who had once called her a pretty little savage when he thought she couldn't hear, the preacher who spoke of Christian charity on Sundays while turning away Cherokee families who sought help during the harsh winter months. Judge Morrison sat behind the imposing oak bench like a vulture perched on a cliff, his black robes making him appear to be carved from shadow itself. To his right sat the prosecutor, a young man named William Hayes, who had arrived from Austin with Morrison, and who clearly viewed this case as an opportunity to make his reputation on the bones of an Indian girl with no voice to defend herself. "This court is now in session," Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. "The territory of Texas versus Rose Whitehorse, charged with murder in the first degree. The trial proceeded with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled machine. Prosecutor Hayes presented his evidence methodically. The bottle of strychnine found in Rose's quarters, her known access to Judge Blackwater's food and drink, her motive of revenge against the man who had shown her Christian kindness by taking her into his home. He painted a picture of an ungrateful savage who had repaid charity with treachery, playing on every prejudice and fear that festered in the hearts of the jury. Dr. Mitchell testified about the symptoms of strychnine poisoning, describing in clinical detail how Judge Blackwater had died in agony, his body convulsing as the poison attacked his nervous system. Several townspeople took the stand to testify about Rose's strange behavior and sullen attitude, as if sadness in the face of cruelty was somehow evidence of guilt. Throughout it all, Rose sat in silence. Her court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man named Edwin Walsh, who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, offered only the most perfunctory defense. He suggested that perhaps the judge's death had been accidental, that maybe Rose had confused bottles while preparing his medicine. It was a weak argument, delivered without conviction, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. As the morning wore on, the heat in the packed courthouse became stifling. Women fanned themselves with programs printed for the occasion, and men loosened their collars as sweat stained their shirts. Through the tall windows, Rose could see the gallows that had been erected in the town square the previous evening, its noose swaying gently in the morning breeze like a dancer waiting for music to begin. It was then that the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a crash that echoed through the chamber like thunder. Every head turned as Dakota Stormwind strode down the center aisle, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor with each determined step. He wore his best clothes, a black wool suit that had seen better days, a white shirt with a string tie, and boots polished to a mirror shine. But it was the Colt Peacemaker on his hip and the set of his shoulders that commanded attention. "Your Honor," Dakota said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "I object to these proceedings." Judge Morrison's eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. "Sir, this is highly irregular. You are not an officer of this court, and—" "I'm the husband of the defendant," Dakota interrupted, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. "Dakota Stormwind, and this is my wife, Rose Stormwind. We were married by circuit preacher in Amarillo 6 months ago." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Voices rose in shock and outrage, with some calling Dakota a liar while others demanded to see the marriage certificate. Rose herself stared at him in complete bewilderment, her composure finally cracking as she tried to understand what was happening. Sheriff Ironwood moved toward Dakota with his hand on his gun, but Dakota held up the paper with steady fingers. "It's all legal and proper, Sheriff. Witnessed and filed with the county clerk in Potter County. You can telegraph to verify if you like." Judge Morrison took the document and examined it with the intensity of a man trying to spot a counterfeit bill. The marriage certificate was beautifully crafted, complete with official seals and signatures that looked authentic enough to fool anyone who wasn't an expert forger. In truth, Dakota had paid a printer in Amarillo $50 to create it the previous evening, using his knowledge of legal documents gained during his years as a Texas Ranger. "Even if this is genuine," Morrison said finally, "it doesn't change the facts of this case. The defendant is still accused of murder." "But it changes everything else," Dakota replied, moving to stand beside Rose's chair. For the first time in 3 days, she was no longer alone. Under Texas law, a married woman cannot be compelled to testify against her husband, and property acquired during marriage belongs to both spouses. That includes any evidence found in the marital home. Prosecutor Hayes jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is a transparent attempt to obstruct justice. The marriage is clearly fraudulent, designed to—" "Are you questioning the validity of a legal document filed with the territorial government?" Dakota asked mildly, though his eyes held a dangerous glint. "Because if you are, I'd be happy to discuss it with you outside." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Dakota's reputation had preceded him to Copper Ridge, and everyone in the courtroom knew he had killed at least 6 men in fair fights during his career as a lawman. Prosecutor Hayes swallowed hard and sat back down. Rose found her voice for the first time since the trial began. "Your Honor," she said quietly, her words carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom, "I don't understand what's happening." Dakota placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture so natural it almost looked genuine to the watching crowd. "I came as soon as I heard, darling. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." Judge Morrison studied them both with calculating eyes. He was a practical man who understood that territorial politics required certain accommodations, especially when federal marshals might become involved in cases involving Indian rights. The last thing Austin wanted was another incident like the one at Wounded Knee to complicate relations with Washington. "Mr. Stormwind," Morrison said carefully, "your arrival is certainly timely. However, the evidence against your alleged wife is substantial. Do you have anything to present in her defense?" Dakota's smile was cold as winter starlight. "As a matter of fact, Your Honor, I do. You see, I've spent the last 6 months investigating Judge Blackwater's activities on behalf of the federal government, and what I've discovered might interest this court very much indeed." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, thick with documents and photographs. The sight of it made Sheriff Ironwood go pale, and several men in the crowd began shifting nervously in their seats. "Judge Blackwater wasn't murdered for personal revenge," Dakota continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He was killed to prevent the exposure of a systematic campaign of fraud and murder that has been going on in this county for over a decade. A campaign that involves forged death certificates, stolen land, and the elimination of inconvenient witnesses." The courthouse fell silent except for the sound of Dakota's spurs as he approached the bench. "Your Honor, I submit to this court evidence that Judge Samuel Blackwater was not a victim of murder but the architect of it. And the woman sitting in that defendant's chair isn't his killer. She's the key witness to his crimes." As Dakota spread the documents across the judge's bench, Rose felt something she hadn't experienced in 10 years of captivity and 3 days of imprisonment. For the first time since she had watched her mother die in Judge Blackwater's house, she felt hope. The truth, when it finally emerged in that sweltering courthouse, came not as a thunderclap, but as a slow poison seeping through the floorboards of everything the people of Copper Ridge thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the man they had trusted to dispense both. Dakota's evidence lay spread across Judge Morrison's bench like cards in a deadly game of poker. Photograph after photograph showed Cherokee families who had supposedly died of disease or accident, their deaths conveniently timed to coincide with valuable land discoveries. Death certificates bearing Judge Blackwater's seal, all signed by the same hand despite being attributed to different doctors. Bank records showing large deposits into Blackwater's account, always dated within days of a Cherokee family's mysterious demise. But it was the final document that brought the House of Lies crashing down. A letter written in Judge Blackwater's own careful script, addressed to a business associate in Austin. In it, he described his final solution to the Cherokee problem and mentioned the half-breed girl who has become too curious for her own good. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Dakota said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent years testifying in courtrooms across Texas, "Judge Samuel Blackwater didn't die because Rose Whitehorse wanted revenge. He died because he was planning to kill her, just as he had killed her mother 10 years ago." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some voices rose in denial, others in outrage. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair, her face white with shock. "That's impossible," she cried. "Samuel Blackwater was a pillar of this community." "Samuel Blackwater was a murderer," Dakota replied flatly. "And every person in this room who looked the other way while Cherokee families disappeared is complicit in his crimes." Sheriff Ironwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness. His hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket, where Dakota knew he kept the small leather notebook that contained records of every payment Blackwater had made for his special services. Rose watched the proceedings with a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. These people, her neighbors, the folks she had served faithfully for 10 years, were learning that their comfortable assumptions about good and evil, about civilization and savagery, had been built on a foundation of bones and blood money. Judge Morrison studied the documents with the careful attention of a man whose political future depended on making the right decision. The territorial government had sent him to clean up a mess, not to create a bigger one. But the evidence before him was overwhelming, and federal marshals were already investigating similar cases across Indian Territory. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Stormwind," Morrison said finally. "But even if everything you say is true, it doesn't change the fact that Judge Blackwater is dead and your wife was found with the poison." "Actually, Your Honor, it changes everything." Dakota pulled out one final document, this one sealed with official federal government stamps. "3 days ago, I received authorization from the U.S. Marshal's office to place Judge Blackwater under arrest for crimes against the Cherokee Nation. I arrived in Copper Ridge to find him already dead, but not from strychnine poisoning." The silence that followed was so complete that Rose could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Dakota continued, his voice steady as granite. "Dr. Mitchell, would you please tell this court what you found when you examined Judge Blackwater's body?" The elderly doctor rose from his seat like a man walking to his own execution. His hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. I found evidence of strychnine poisoning, just as I reported." "Did you also find evidence of laudanum poisoning, a massive overdose that would have killed him hours before the strychnine ever took effect?" Dr. Mitchell's face crumpled like old parchment. "Yes," he whispered, "but Judge Blackwater, he told me to keep that quiet, said it would be better for the town if people thought it was murder rather than suicide." The courtroom exploded again, but this time the chaos was different. This was the sound of a community realizing it had been living a lie, that the man they had trusted with their safety had been orchestrating their neighbors' deaths for profit. "Suicide?" Prosecutor Hayes demanded, his carefully constructed case disintegrating before his eyes. "Are you saying Judge Blackwater killed himself?" "I'm saying Judge Blackwater took his own life rather than face justice for his crimes," Dakota replied. "But before he died, he planted evidence to ensure that Rose would be blamed for his death. One final act of cruelty against the Cherokee people who had suffered so much at his hands." Rose found her voice, speaking for the first time with the strength that had sustained her through 10 years of servitude and 3 days of imprisonment. "He told me I would hang for what I knew," she said, her words cutting through the courtroom's chaos like a blade through silk. "He said no one would ever believe a half-breed girl over a respected white judge. Even in death, he wanted to destroy me." Mary Clearwater stood up in the back of the courtroom, her weathered face streaked with tears. "Samuel Blackwater came to me 18 years ago," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "He had a little boy and a little girl with him, Cherokee children he said he'd found abandoned on the prairie. He took the girl to raise as his servant and left the boy with me to forget his heritage." She pointed at Dakota with a trembling finger. "That boy grew up to be the man standing before you now, and that little girl grew up to be Rose Whitehorse, their brother and sister, and Samuel Blackwater spent 20 years trying to erase their connection to each other and to their people." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Rose turned to stare at Dakota with new eyes, seeing for the first time the familiar curve of his jaw, the same high cheekbones that she saw in her own reflection. The Cherokee features that Judge Blackwater had tried to beat out of both of them were still there, written in the bones of their faces like a heritage that could not be destroyed. Dakota moved to Rose's side and, for the first time since entering the courtroom, allowed his mask of professional composure to slip. "I've been looking for my sister for 20 years," he said quietly. "I just never knew her name was Rose." Judge Morrison looked down at the evidence spread before him, then at the two Cherokee siblings standing together in defiance of everything Samuel Blackwater had tried to accomplish. The political calculation was simple. He could either perpetuate an injustice that would bring federal investigators swarming over Copper Ridge, or he could do the right thing and let the chips fall where they would. "This court hereby dismisses all charges against Rose Whitehorse," he announced. "Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the deaths of all Cherokee families in this county over the past 20 years. As the gavel fell, Rose Whitehorse walked free for the first time in her life. The truth, when it finally came to light in the hours following Rose's acquittal, arrived not as the liberation she had dreamed of during those 3 dark nights in her cell, but as something far more complex and devastating. Freedom, she discovered, could be its own kind of prison when the world you emerged into had been built on the bones of everything you had lost. Dakota led her from the courthouse through a crowd that parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of shame, curiosity, and the peculiar resentment that some people harbor toward those who survive what should have destroyed them. The morning sun felt foreign on her skin after 3 days of captivity, and Rose found herself walking closer to Dakota than propriety would normally allow, drawing comfort from his solid presence beside her. They made their way to the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Mary Clearwater waited with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The moment Rose stepped through the bat-wing doors, the older woman enveloped her in an embrace that smelled of lavender soap and whiskey, of years of hard living and harder love. "My children," Mary whispered, her voice breaking as she pulled Dakota into the embrace as well. "My lost children, come home at last." But even in that moment of reunion, shadows gathered at the edges of their joy. Through the saloon's grimy windows, Rose could see Sheriff Ironwood standing in the middle of Main Street, his hand resting on his gun as he watched the building where the 3 Cherokee survivors had taken refuge. His face was pale with the knowledge that his own crimes were about to be exposed, and desperate men in desperate situations rarely made rational choices. Dakota seemed to sense her unease. He moved to the window, his own hand dropping instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. "Tom Ironwood's got a choice to make," he said quietly. "He can come clean about what he's done and maybe see mercy from a federal judge, or he can try to silence the witnesses to his crimes." Mary poured 3 glasses of whiskey, with hands that trembled only slightly, the amber liquid catching the afternoon light like liquid gold. "Tom's not an evil man," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just a weak one who got in too deep with the wrong people." "Weak men kill just as dead as evil ones," Dakota replied, accepting his glass but not drinking from it. His attention remained fixed on the street outside where a small crowd was beginning to gather around the sheriff. Some faces showed support, others confusion or anger. The town was dividing along invisible lines that had existed long before Rose's trial, but had never been so starkly revealed. Rose took a sip of the whiskey and felt it burn away some of the numbness that had sustained her through the worst of her ordeal. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing more than just the immediate future. What happened to a woman who had spent her entire adult life as a servant and ghost? What happened to siblings who had found each other after 20 years of separation? What happened to a community that had just learned its most respected citizen was a monster? Before Dakota could answer, the saloon doors burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Sheriff Ironwood stood in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame like a thundercloud pregnant with violence. His badge caught the light, but the symbol of law and order seemed tarnished now, weighed down by the knowledge of how it had been corrupted. "We need to talk," Ironwood said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. His eyes darted between Dakota and Rose, then settled on Mary. "All of us." Dakota's hand moved to his gun, a subtle shift that everyone in the room noticed. "Tom, you're welcome to say your piece, but I'd advise you to keep your hands where I can see them." Ironwood raised his palms in a gesture of surrender, but the tension in his shoulders suggested a man balanced on the knife's edge of violence. "I ain't here to cause trouble, Dakota. I'm here because—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed to stick in his throat like broken glass. "Because I got something to confess." Mary gestured toward an empty chair at their table, her saloon-keeper's instincts automatically trying to defuse the situation. "Sit down, Tom. Have a drink. Say what you came to say." The big sheriff lowered himself into the chair with the careful movements of a man who had aged a decade in the span of a morning. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Judge Blackwater didn't kill himself," he said. "I poisoned him." The confession hung in the air like gun smoke, acrid and undeniable. Rose felt the bottom drop out of her stomach, and Dakota's hand tightened on his weapon. Only Mary seemed unsurprised, as if she had been waiting years for this moment to arrive. "I put laudanum in his brandy 3 nights ago," Ironwood continued, his words coming faster now, as if the dam of his silence had finally burst, enough to kill a horse. "I knew about the land scheme, about the murders. Hell, I helped with some of them. But when he said he was going to kill Rose to keep her quiet—" The sheriff's voice broke. "I couldn't let him hurt another child." Dakota leaned forward, his lawman's instincts taking over despite the personal nature of the situation. Why frame Rose for murder instead of just letting people think Blackwater died of natural causes? "Because the bastard was too smart for that," Ironwood spat. "He knew I was having second thoughts about the whole operation. Before he died, he planted that strychnine bottle in Rose's room and left a letter saying she'd threatened him. He wanted to make sure that even if someone killed him, he'd take an innocent girl down with him." Rose found her voice, though it sounded foreign to her own ears. "You let me sit in that jail for 3 days, knowing I was innocent?" Ironwood met her gaze, and she saw genuine remorse in his bloodshot eyes. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of what would happen if the truth came out. Scared of losing my job, my pension, everything I'd worked for. But mostly scared that folks would learn I'd been taking money to look the other way while families died." "How many?" Dakota asked, his voice deadly quiet. "How many Cherokee families died because of your cowardice?" The sheriff's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of 20 years of guilt had finally settled on them fully. 17 families. 63 people total, counting the children. He looked up at Rose with eyes that pleaded for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. "Your mama was the first. She found out about the land scheme and threatened to expose it. Blackwater told me to make it look like consumption. And God forgive me, I did what he asked." The revelation hit Rose like a physical blow. For 10 years, she had mourned her mother's death from disease, had even felt guilty for sometimes resenting Anna Whitehorse for leaving her alone in a hostile world. To learn now that her mother had been murdered for trying to protect Cherokee land rights, that her death had been the opening note in a symphony of genocide, was almost too much to bear. "She was trying to save people," Rose whispered, tears finally coming after days of stoic endurance. "Mama was trying to save our people, and you killed her for it." "I didn't pull the trigger," Ironwood said weakly. Blackwater did that. I just made sure nobody asked too many questions afterward." Dakota's voice was ice and iron when he spoke. "That makes you an accessory to murder, Tom. 63 counts of it." The sheriff nodded, acceptance settling over his features like a shroud. "I know, and I'm ready to face the consequences. But first, I want to help make things right." He reached into his coat pocket slowly, withdrawing a small leather notebook bound with string. "This contains records of every payment Blackwater made to me, every family that was killed, every piece of land that was stolen. Federal marshals are going to want to see it." Mary Clearwater had remained silent throughout the confession, but now she spoke with the authority of someone who had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by its capacity for both evil and redemption. "Tom Ironwood, you're a foolish, weak man who let greed and fear turn you into something monstrous. But the fact that you're sitting here now, willing to face justice instead of running, suggests there might be something decent left in you after all." "It's too little, too late," the sheriff replied. "But maybe it'll help bring some peace to the families of the folks who died." Outside, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of federal marshals who had been summoned by telegraph from Austin. The investigation that Dakota had initiated was about to expand far beyond Copper Ridge, exposing a network of corruption and murder that stretched across Indian Territory. As the marshals entered the saloon to take Sheriff Ironwood into custody, Rose felt a strange sense of completion settling over her. The truth, terrible as it was, had finally been spoken aloud. Her mother had not died of disease but had been murdered for her courage. Judge Blackwater had not been a benevolent patriarch, but a calculating killer. And she, Rose Whitehorse, was not alone in the world but had a brother who had traveled hundreds of miles to stand beside her when she needed him most. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be trials to endure, testimony to give, and a community to help heal from the wounds of deception and complicity. But for the first time in her adult life, Rose faced the future not as a powerless servant, but as a woman with a voice, a heritage, and a family willing to fight for justice. Justice, she realized, was not something handed down from a judge's bench, but something fought for and won by ordinary people who refused to let evil flourish in silence. 1 year later, Rose Whitehorse stood on the porch of the small house she and Dakota had built on the land that had once belonged to their mother, watching the sun paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson that no longer reminded her of blood. The Cherokee families who had survived Judge Blackwater's reign of terror had begun to return to Copper Ridge, their legal claims to ancestral lands restored through the federal investigation that had swept through the territory like a cleansing fire. The town itself had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The Silver Dollar Saloon now served as an unofficial community center where Cherokee and white families gathered to plan the future of a place that was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to become worthy of the word home. Mary Clearwater had emerged as an unlikely peacemaker, her decades of experience reading human nature making her uniquely qualified to help former enemies find common ground. Dakota had accepted a position as a federal marshal, traveling throughout Indian Territory to investigate similar cases of corruption and land theft. His work took him away for weeks at a time, but he always returned to the small house on Willow Creek, where Rose had planted a garden of traditional Cherokee vegetables and medicinal herbs that their mother had once grown in secret. The federal trials had been swift and decisive. Sheriff Tom Ironwood had received a sentence of 20 years in Huntsville State Penitentiary, though his cooperation with investigators had spared him the gallows. 3 other men had been hanged for their roles in the murders, including a banker from Austin who had financed the land scheme and a doctor who had falsified death certificates in exchange for gold coins. Judge Blackwater's house had been converted into a school where Cherokee children could learn to read and write in both English and their native language. Rose taught there 3 days a week, sharing the history and customs that had nearly been lost forever. The irony was not lost on her that she now stood in the very rooms where she had once scrubbed floors and endured silent abuse, but now she spoke with authority rather than fear. The marriage certificate that had saved her life had been quietly annulled once their true relationship became known, though Rose sometimes wondered if the love between siblings might be stronger than any bond between husband and wife. Dakota had become the family she had dreamed of during those long nights in Judge Blackwater's house, someone who would always answer when she called, who would always believe her truth even when the world refused to listen. On quiet evenings like this one, Rose would sit on her porch and remember her mother's voice, the Cherokee lullabies that Anna Whitehorse had sung in whispers so that Judge Blackwater wouldn't hear. Those songs had survived along with the recipes for traditional medicines and the stories of ancestors who had walked these same lands before white men arrived with their papers and their hunger for ownership. Mary Clearwater often joined her for these evening reflections, the two women sharing the comfortable silence of survivors who had learned that some wounds heal slowly but completely. They would speak of practical things, the school's need for new books, the progress of the federal investigation, the families who were slowly rebuilding their lives on restored land, but underneath ran the deeper current of gratitude for a justice that had come late but had come nonetheless. As darkness settled over the creek that once again ran clear with spring water, Rose reflected on the words that Judge Morrison had spoken on the day of her acquittal. This court finds that Rose Whitehorse has not only been wrongfully accused, but has shown remarkable courage in preserving evidence that has brought justice to scores of victims. The courage, Rose knew now, had come not from any heroic impulse, but from the simple refusal to disappear the way Judge Blackwater had wanted her to. Sometimes, survival itself was the greatest act of defiance, and sometimes the most powerful truth was simply the decision to keep breathing when the world tried to suffocate you. In the distance, she could hear the sound of children playing, their laughter mixing Cherokee and English words in the easy way of those who have never been taught that their heritage was something to hide. Home, Rose thought, looked different than she had imagined, but it sounded exactly right. Sometimes the greatest victories in life come not from conquering mountains, but from finding the courage to come home to ourselves. Rose and Dakota's story reminds us that family isn't always about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to stand beside us when the world feels too heavy to bear alone. At 18, Rose thought she was powerless, just another forgotten face in a system designed to silence her voice. But her quiet strength, her refusal to disappear even when everyone wanted her to, became the very foundation that brought justice to an entire community. How many of us have felt invisible at times, wondering if our struggles matter to anyone? How many of us have discovered that the family we choose can heal wounds that biology never could? Rose found her brother when she needed him most, but more importantly, she found her own voice. Mary Clearwater, at 60, became the grandmother she had always been meant to be. Sheriff Ironwood learned that it's never too late to choose courage over comfort. Their small Texas town discovered that healing begins when we stop looking away from hard truths and start believing that broken people can become whole again. Have you ever had someone show up in your darkest moment and refuse to let you face it alone? What would you say to someone who feels forgotten by the world right now? Share your story below. Your voice matters more than you know.